Right before we jump into this video, if you'd like me to send you a free guide to capturing motion in low-light situations, just look for this orange box over on FroKnowsPhoto.com, put your name, email address in it, hit send it. I'm going to send you that guide for free. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and in this video, I'm going to compare the Canon R10, the R7, and the R8 to help you decide which one might be the right one for you. Now, I've used all of these cameras in the real world, so I have extensive use testing them out to give you a better idea of which one might be for you if you're looking to purchase it. Now, if you're looking to purchase any of these cameras, there is an affiliate link down below to each one of them. If you do use our affiliate link, it helps us to continue to make free videos like this. And lastly, before getting into all of the specs, I do have user guides for setting up each one of these cameras that are over an hour, but they are fantastic to help you set up the camera if you do own one of these. But now let's talk about the image sensors inside of these cameras. The Canon R10 has a cropped 24.2 megapixel sensor. The R7 has a 32.5 megapixel cropped sensor, and the EOS R8 has a 24.2 megapixel full frame sensor. Now, the full frame sensor in this camera is the same one that you find in the more expensive Canon R6 Mark II. Now, I've mentioned different sensor sizes here. We've got cropped sensor cameras, which has a smaller sensor, and a full frame camera, which has a larger sensor. Now, there's pros and cons to both of them, whereas a full frame sensor is going to be better in low light situations because you have a larger sensor, but a cropped sensor gives you the appearance of a longer reach when you put a lens on it. So if you're trying to photograph birds at a distance, you're going to get more bang for your buck when you put a longer lens on one of these cameras. But again, it's a smaller sensor, you might not get better high ISO capability. Now, that's dumbing it down just a little bit, but now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about the processors inside of these cameras as well as the ISO capabilities. Now, the Canon R10, the R7, and the R8, they all have the same processor. It's a Digic X processor or Digic 10 processor. That is a very good image processing unit inside of these cameras because that's what you find in the top of the line cameras at the time of recording this. That is amazing. So let's talk about ISO. The R10 has a native ISO of 100 to 32,000, expandable up to 51,200. The R7 has an ISO range that's the same of 100 to 32,000, expandable up to 51,200. And the R8 has an ISO native of 100 to 102,400, expandable all the way up to 204,800. So they get the same ISO capability. They can't go as high as the R8, which you can see goes much higher than the other two because the full frame capability. Full frame sensors are just better when it comes to low light situations. So just keep that in mind when you're taking these out into the real world, that if you're in lower light situations with a crop sensor camera and you push that ISO up higher, you're going to introduce more noise and grain than you would with a full frame camera. Now I'm going to introduce something called a check mark. A check mark is something that I give to the camera that I think did better. Obviously, in this case, who gets a check mark for ISO? The R8, because it's better in low light situations. Moving on, let's talk about the lens options and the RF mount. This area right here, this is your lens mount. Now, there's no lenses on these cameras, but the lens mount that Canon has is called the RF lens mount. You can get different types of lenses. There's Canon RFS, which are designed primarily for crop sensor cameras, and you wouldn't want to put that on a full frame camera because it's not going to cover the whole image area. But they also make full frame lenses, which are just RF lenses. They have an entire lineup of RF glass, which is absolutely fantastic, some of the best options across the industry. The good news is you can put full frame lenses on to the crop sensor bodies because they have the same exact RF mount. Now, Canon has also opened up their mount to third-party manufacturers like Sigma and Tamron. So you now will have the option to get third-party glass that's possibly less expensive, but still really good in quality if you're looking to save some money. But Canon does have some amazing RF lenses, and the RF mount is fantastic. Now let's talk about the autofocus systems inside of these cameras. They're exactly the same across the board. Even though you have more expensive cameras and less expensive cameras, you have the dual pixel AF2. It's the second generation of dual pixel AF, and it's basically the same autofocusing system that you would find in Canon's R3, which used to be a $6,000 body. You are getting fantastic autofocus across this system. You've got humans, animals, vehicle, and subject detection options. IAF is built in, and one of my most favorite features in photography history is the fact that it will find the subject's eye and continuously track them across the board. So nobody's getting a check mark here because they all do a great job with autofocus. Let me jump in here real quick because I want to show you this photo taken with a Canon camera and edited with FroPack 4, starting with Blue's Clues, followed by Brooklyn, C41, Copper Tone, High C, Kaleidoscope, Mel Brooks, Saltwater Taffy, Thick, and Wet Hot American Summer. But my all-time favorite from FroPack 1 is Skittles. With one click, we go boom. But check this out. Exclusive and all new to FroPack 4 are these 4 custom adaptive Lightroom presets that we call X1, X2, X3, and X4. Let's click on X1 for Face Enhance. So it's gonna go ahead and do all of the masking for you without having to do anything. I'm gonna click on Facial Skin right here because let's show you what happens if I do less with this slider, or I can do more. And look how perfect it is making this skin. It's so easy and simple to use. So look, if you want to speed up your raw workflow, give yourself a great starting point, or you're just tired of other people's presets sucking, ours don't suck. We created 14 all new custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/FroPack4. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters, and if you decide to pick them up right now, they are currently on sale. Or if you want to get the Grand Slam bundle that includes FroPack 1, which has Skittles, FroPack 2, 3, and 4, you can save even more. Now, let's get back to the video. Now let's talk about frame rate. That's how many frames per second you can get when you're taking continuous images. The Canon R10 will give you 15 frames per second with a mechanical shutter. You can get 23 frames per second with the electronic shutter, but keep in mind when you're using the electronic shutter, you might get something called rolling shutter. And what that is if you look at these boards at the hockey game, as I'm panning with the subject and taking pictures, the boards are bending. That's because of a slower readout speed. So keep that in mind. If you're using the electronic shutter in the R10 or the R7, you're gonna run into possible bowing issues, say with baseball bats, golf clubs, hockey sticks, or any objects that are flying might start to be oblonged because of the sensor readout speed. So now let's go on to the R7. The R7 is 15 frames per second with a mechanical shutter and 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. So you see you're getting 7 more frames per second with the electronic shutter over the Canon R10. Now, all the way to the full frame R8, you get 6 frames per second with first curtain electronic shutter and 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter. Now, you don't run into the same issues as much with the R10 and the R7 in terms of rolling shutter because this has a much faster readout speed. The Canon R6 Mark II is fantastic with that, and I've shot a lot of different sports with the R8 and really haven't run into issues with bowing where I would run into the same issues with these two cameras right here. Now, to add on to that, the R8 also has variable shutter rate options. So if you run into areas where you're seeing a lot of flicker, you can dial in a different shutter speed like in between. So instead of just 1/3200th of a second, it could be 131.295, whatever it is. You can dial that in to meet the flicker of whatever the light is doing. Now, you do not have a full mechanical shutter inside of the R8. Now, I love the fact that we get 15 frames per second with a mechanical shutter of these, but if you're looking to shoot completely silent, you can do that across the board. I don't know why I got quieter, because I was talking about being more silent, but only 6 frames per second with the first curtain shutter is pretty limiting inside of this camera, but 40 is more than I get with a top-of-the-line Canon R3, and that is insane. That's why we're getting 40 check marks right here. Now, being that you can shoot so many frames per second with these cameras, what is the max burst rate and where does the buffer fill? So let's start with the R10. You can get 29 RAW files in a row when you're shooting at 15 frames per second with the mechanical shutter. You can get 21 RAW files when you're shooting at the 23 frames per second with the electronic shutter. That means you're getting less than a full second with the electronic shutter before the buffer is filled. Now that's if you're shooting RAW. If you're shooting JPEGs, you're going to get a lot more, and you're probably not going to outrun the buffer. I personally shoot RAW. If you don't know the difference, RAW is the uncompressed data. It's all of the information that the camera is capturing. A JPEG is smushing that up, throwing away a bunch of the data that they don't think that you need, and then baking that in. RAW files are always going to be better in my opinion, but JPEGs are very good if you don't want to edit your own files. Now moving on to the R7, you'll get 51 RAW files at 15 frames per second, so obviously you have a larger buffer in there. You can get 42 RAW files at 30 frames per second, so a little bit more than just a second of continuous shooting, and the same with JPEGs. You're going to get a lot more JPEGs before you ever touch that buffer. The R8, you're going to do 56 RAW files at 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter. So you get a lot of files with these because you have a pretty nice buffer. Now keep in mind, you don't want to just spray and pray. If you are finding yourself shooting RAW and reaching the limits of these buffers, try to do quicker bursts of a half second. Don't hold your finger down for a whole second. The buffer will clear much quicker when it doesn't fill all the way up. At least I've seen that when I've been shooting and testing out filling the buffer. Now, one of the reasons you're able to have a larger buffer are the memory card slots. These cameras have what's called UHS 2 SD card slots. That is the faster slot, which means you're going to be able to write to that much quicker, which means the buffer clears and you can continuously shoot. Now, there are some differences here. The R10 has 1 card slot. The R8 has 1 card slot. The R7 has how many card slots, Stephen?
2.
2 card slots. So 2 is better than 1, right, Stephen?
Yep.
In this case, 2 is better than 1, and in other cases, 2 is better than 1 as well. Like 2 become 1, like the Spice Girls said, 2 become 1. That's better than just being with yourself. But anyway, the dual card slots is something that I absolutely love. I'm a redundant shooter, meaning I have what goes to card 1 is going to card 2. I don't like not having the option for a second card. Knock on wood, really haven't run into issues with cards just blowing up and failing too often. It's happened in the past. It's something that I hope doesn't happen, but just keep in mind, dual card slots is generally better if you're gonna shoot redundant than just having a single card slot. So in this case, 2 check marks here for the R7. Now let's talk about max shutter speeds. The Canon R10 will max out at a shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second for both mechanical as well as electronic. You will find that professional cameras back in the day, DSLRs, maxed out at a 1/8000th of a second, whereas consumer cameras topped out at around 1/4000th of a second. The R7 will give you 1/8000th of a second with the mechanical shutter and 1/16,000th of a second with the electronic shutter. The R8 will give you 1/4000th of a second with the electronic front curtain, 1/8000th of a second with the electronic, and 1/16,000th of a second in manual one shot. Now you do have the option in one shot to get to 1/16,000th of a second with this, and that's going to come in handy when you're shooting with f1.2 glass or 1.4 or 1.8, the faster glass in brighter situations, and then you don't have to get an ND filter if you can raise your shutter speed higher. So in this case, I'm gonna give a check mark to the full frame camera. Even though it's limited a little bit more, I still give a check mark to the R8 because I absolutely love the R8, but it's nice that the R7 gives you 1/16,000th of a second with the electronic shutter and 1/8000th with the mechanical. So we're gonna give 1/16,000th of a check mark to the R8. Let me jump in here real quick and let you know this video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you're looking to build your very own online portfolio, use what I've been using for my personal photo website for more than 10 years at this point because it's simple, easy, affordable, and I don't need to know any coding. To get your 14-day free trial, head on over to squarespace.com/FroKnowsPhoto. If you decide that it's for you, use the code FroKnowsPhoto at checkout to get 10% off your first order. Now, let's get back to the video. Now let's start moving on to the video features, and we're going to start with image stabilization in the bodies. Which one of these cameras has image stabilization? This one, the R7. The other two have digital image stabilization, which means it's going to do some cropping in when you get to the video. It also doesn't help you when you're shooting in lower light situations or slower shutter speeds for still images, but this one has the image stabilization built in. Now keep in mind, different lenses do have image stabilization or IBIS built in, so you will get some stabilization there, but it is always nice to have the joint stabilization between the body and the lens. Now let's move on to the video features of the R10. We've got full width 4K video up to 30 frames per second, which is oversampled from 6K. You get 4K at 60 frames per second. You got 1080p up to 120 frames per second and no log recording. Now the R7 gives you full width 4K video up to 30 frames per second, oversampled from 7K, full width 4K 60 frames per second, 1080p up to 120 frames per second. You've got C-Log 3, and it can auto level with its IBIS mechanism. That's a pretty cool feature, which will slightly correct for leveling if you're off and you're on a tripod. You'll see that it actually corrects for it. Pretty interesting. The R8 can do full width 4K video up to 60 frames per second, oversampled from 6K, 1080p up to 180 frames per second, and you have C-Log 3. So when it comes to video, image stabilization for video is going to be better. So in that case, the R7 is going to get a check mark. But overall, I prefer having full frame when it comes to video, especially in lower light situations. This camera locked off or on a gimbal is still going to do a really good job. That's why I love full frame over crop sensor. But these all are going to give you a long record time that you don't have to stop at 29 minutes and 59 seconds. Now, if you are shooting video, one of the most important things to remember is audio is important. You can have the worst looking video, but it sounds good, and people will give you a pass. But if you have a video that sounds really terrible, but maybe looks really good, people aren't going to want to pay attention. So you do have a microphone input jack on all of these cameras. You have headphone jacks on these two right here. You do not have a headphone jack for monitoring on the R10. But what each of these cameras does have is a digital hot shoe. That means if you take one of Canon's digital hot shoe capable microphones, you plug that right in here, and it's taking the audio without a cable being plugged into the mic jack and putting it right into your file. A digital hot shoe is fantastic, and it's great that it comes across the board, so Canon is getting a check mark. Now let's take a look at the electronic viewfinders. They each have the same resolution, but slightly different magnifications. You'll notice that on the back of these cameras with the electronic viewfinder, that with the R10, it's slightly smaller. With the R7 and the R8, they're very similar in size. That's why the magnifications are closer together. So let's look at those numbers. 2.36 million dot EVF across the board on these. Now, being that I mentioned the electronic viewfinder, I should always say that you should probably put your eyes through it, look through it when you're taking pictures. I know some of you out there, this might be your first camera. I'll just give you a quick tutorial on how to hold the camera. Tuck those elbows, put your camera up to your eye, whether it's your left eye or your right eye. Put your left hand underneath to control the lens. Don't put it up top. Don't be dainty with it. Put it underneath, lock in. Look through the viewfinder. Don't use the LCD screen unless you have to. I know a lot of people are trained to do that with cell phones these days, but it is much better to put your eye up to the viewfinder and take photos. Now, speaking of LCD screens, these all have vari-angle flip out and rotatable screens. The two right here have the same resolution. This resolution is slightly lower, not that big of a deal, but it flips out and rotates. So if you want to shoot over something, you can hold it up, flip the screen down like this, you're good to go, or hold it down low and flip the screen and you're good to go. Or if you're shooting video, you put it into selfie mode, you flip it back, you're watching yourself on the screen and you're getting the video that way. Now chugging along here, let's talk about some of the differences in the bodies. As you can see, the R10 is the smallest body up here and the R7 is thicker, a little bit more chodier than the R8. The R8 is really a tiny small body, but it does feel very nice in the hands. Now it doesn't have a joystick on the back of it, where you have a spinny wheel on the R7 along with a joystick in the middle for controlling focusing points and spinning your aperture, your shutter speed, or whatever you set that dial to. Now you're very limited on what you have on the R10, but it is nice that it has a dial on the top right as well for controlling shutter speed and your aperture or whatever you decide to set that to as well. Now there's no vertical grips or battery grips extensions that you can get for these cameras. You can get a dummy extension for the R8, which is good to use. It doesn't do anything other than allow your pinky to have a place to go if you have bigger hands. I like having that extension on there. It just makes it feel like a better camera in your hands. But across the board, Canon has done a great job with the feel and design of the bodies. So check mark goes to the designer of these bodies. Let me jump in here real quick and say, are you tired of asking your friends and family for feedback on your photos and all you get are thumbs up emojis and fire emojis, but no actual feedback? Well, I offer two options to help be your mentor. Head on over to FroKnowsPhoto.com/mentorship. Over there, you'll see two different options that I offer. One is a 15-minute recorded rapid fire critique of your work, and the other is a 45-minute live one-on-one mentorship call over Zoom, where you talk with me directly and I give you feedback. So if you're looking for someone who's not just going to say thumbs up or fire emoji, I'm going to tell you like it is to help you become a better photographer. So once again, head on over to FroKnowsPhoto.com/mentorship to check out the examples over there and pick which one is best for you. Now, let's get back to the video. Now here's where you find some differences with these cameras, and that's in the battery life and the type of battery that you get in the cameras. These two on the end take the LPE17 battery. Now you do have USB-C charging where you can just plug into these cameras and get charging out of them or charge while you're shooting. But what's great is that the R7 has an LPE6NH battery. Now that bigger battery gives you basically twice the power. Now when it comes to shooting video, you're going to get roughly 2 hours of record time with these and up to 6 hours with this one right here. So a bigger battery in this case is better when it comes to record time. And of course, you don't need to have as many extra batteries if you get more juice out of a charge. I do recommend you always have extra batteries, or at this point start carrying around one of those phone chargers, which you generally have, which everybody has at this point, that is USB-C charging, because you can always get extra juice when you're on the move to get the battery charged up. Now let's move on to price. Now keep in mind, this is the price at the time of recording this, and some of these cameras are on sale right now. The R10 comes in at $879 on sale, normally $979. The R7 is $1,399 on sale, normally $1,499. And the R8 is a couple $100 off at $1,199, where normally it's $1,500. This is where it gets tough to make a decision, because that's what I want to help you do right here, is decide which one of these might be right for you. Look, if you don't have $1,400 to spend and you just want to get into the world of a mirrorless Canon camera, this R10 is really capable when it comes to photographing kids and birds and sports and action. You get more bang for your buck with the crop sensor because you're getting 1.6 times the magnification equivalent when you put a lens on here, so that's going to be good for birds. You're going to get the same autofocus capability. You have to say, if you're deciding between these two, the R10 and the R7, do you need the extra card slot? Do you need the bigger battery? Or do you want to save money so that you can spend more money on the lenses? Because it's all about glass, 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 glass. This R7 is basically a pro-end feeling camera because it has a lot of great features and it's crop sensor. It's not full frame, but it's going to be good for weddings. It's going to be good for sports and action and birds and tracking because you have amazing autofocus capability, but in lower light situations, it's not going to be as good as the R8. The R8 is one of my all-time favorite cameras in the history of cameras being made. I took this to Paris as my only camera with a 28-70 f2 RF piece of glass. Now that's an expensive lens at $3,000, but I was confident enough in my trip to risk taking the smaller battery and the 1 card slot for my Paris trip, and I wasn't disappointed at all. Do I need more than 6 frames a second? In a lot of situations, yes, but in the sports that I shot, whether it was baseball or the Harlem Globetrotters, the 40 frames a second was fantastic and incredible without any issues. I personally would lean towards a full frame body, but if you're a birder and you need more reach, I mean, the R7 is a very nice system, a nice camera. Across the board, you can't go wrong getting into Canon's ecosystem. There's a lot of great lenses, with third-party lenses being an option now. There's a lot of those as well to save some money. So across the board, these are great. And if you can't tell by now, we don't add up check marks because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day which one is better. But if you want to purchase any of these, we do have affiliate links down below. And don't forget, I have user guides to help you set up these cameras when you do buy them. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.